Right now, as we speak, Clay Reed, who heads a team at my institute, the Yale Institute, has 6 electron microscopes where they cut this week and next week 25,000 slices at 35 nanometers in a mouse brain to take 250 million images in a cubic millimeter of mouse cortex, and then work together with the Neuromancer team at Google and with Sebastian Sang at Princeton to do the stitching. We do that in-house, and then to work with them to do 3-dimensional automation. State of the art is now, it's amazing, it's a one-click Golgi. You can go, so it's a couple of terabytes. It lives in the cloud thanks to AWS. And you can click on any profile and the thing will automatically reconstruct the associated neurons. It's just freaking amazing. In 10 years from now, we'll probably be able to do that, to scale it up and to do it for the entire human, for the entire mouse connectome. This is now within the realm of the possible. So that's 1,000 petabyte, that's an exabyte. And then probably another couple of years later, we'll be able to do it. And in fact, we're trying to do it also in a human 1 by 1 by 3 millimeter piece of column. But in 10 or 15 years, we'll be able to do that for the human at EM level resolution, where we get a zettabyte, okay, sort of more than the entire internet today. Now, we can look at that, all right, and we can see if we are interested, like I'm deeply interested in consciousness, right? So consciousness is any experience. That's how I define it. Very simple experience like pain or pleasure, like an experience like a cat or a mouse certainly has, or even a bee has, to very refined states, existentialist dread at the state of America, or being in love, or any of those states, or even a Buddhist state of no experience, being conscious without having any specific content. And if we try to understand how that emerges, when we have this complete knowledge of the mouse or the human connectome, then we can go back to a letter that Leibniz, the last universal Renaissance man, wrote in 1714. So that's almost exactly 300 years ago, right? Now just keep this image of the EM in mind. He didn't have EM, of course. He was thinking about a mill. A miller's, mill to grind. That was sort of the state of the art of technology at the time. And he makes this following comment in this letter. It's quite famous in the history of mind philosophy. So this is now Leibniz. Even if we had eyes as penetrating as you like, so as to see the smallest part of the structures of bodies, I do not see that we would thereby be any further forward. We would find the origin of perception there as little as we would find it in a watch, where the constituents part of the machine are all visible, or in a mill, where one can even walk around among the wheels. For the difference between a mill and a more refined machine is only a matter of greater and less. We can understand that a machine could produce the most wonderful things in the world, but never that it might perceive them. Today we know that as a hard problem. It's been popularized by the philosopher Dave Chalmers, but it really goes back to Leibniz, if not earlier. So it's a question of mechanisms. Once we know all the mechanisms in the brain, is that enough to understand consciousness? More than 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, Francis Crick and I wrote a series of papers. The main one appeared in Nature, in which we advocated leaving aside the metaphysical problems of consciousness, just to focus on the empirical problem of search for the footprints of consciousness. So you study using various comparative techniques the footprints of consciousness. In other words, when a subject, it could be a human, could be a monkey, could be a mouse. We're now doing mouse experiments in consciousness, or rats. People are doing experiments on the neural correlates of consciousness, that we can track the neural of consciousness in the brain and then identify specific mechanisms. And this program is ongoing. There are many, many labs that do that. And so if we go forward 50 years from now, given the current, fantastic pace of acceleration of technology, I'm sure we'll know exactly these neurons in this part of the brain vibrating at this magical frequency or being in this particular state give rise to conscious sensation. But again, if we think more deeply about it, how is that so much different from René Descartes, who in 1738 said it's a pineal gland. We all laugh today, ha ha, Isn't that naive to suppose it's pineal gland? And today we say, well, it's layer 5 neurons in prefrontal cortex that oscillated a particular way. If you think about it, ultimately, all you can do, you point to some mechanism, and whenever this mechanism seems to be in place, something magical happens, and you experience something. Your pain or pleasure, or see or hear, or feel dread or happiness or whatever. Okay, or it's a corpus callosum. Although in split brain, that would, of course, there are people born without a corpus callosum, so-called agenesis of corpus callosum. Those people seem to be perfectly conscious, so it can't just be the corpus callosum. But, well, I mean, whatever the mechanism is, and there are lots of debates and books being written about it right now by neurologists and surgeons and neuroscientists such as myself, ultimately, all we end with, and this is what Leibniz says, it's mechanisms. So what we really need is a fundamental theory, a fundamental theory that tells us what is it about mechanisms that give rise to consciousness. It has to be a fundamental theory in a sense that tells us, independent of the particular instantiation, whether it's in a mouse or in a human or maybe in a digital computer or maybe the internet or maybe a collection of human pluripotent inducible stem cell neural networks that tells us what is it that gives rise to consciousness. We now, as you probably all know, this is a topic I've thought a lot. You can read the latest in Nature, came out a couple of weeks ago, if you just Google my name. There is one theory, it's called integrated information theory. Don't worry, it's too late in the day to talk to you about the details of the theory. But the theory essentially, so this is due to the work of Giulio Tononi, a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, and it starts out with ontology. It starts out with something very fundamental. It starts out with existence. Now, if we think about, as scientists, how do we know anything exists? We can go back to a beautiful comment in Plato, in the Phaedron by Plato, where he introduces, where Socrates has a dialogue with a stranger from Iliad in Sicily, the Greek colony. And this stranger, this Eleatic stranger says, well, anything that has causal power exists. The more causal power that this thing has, the more it exists. And that's really what we use. We rarely think about it in science, but ultimately that's what we use, for example, in physics, the fundamental of all science. It has to have causal power. Something exists only to the extent that it has causal power, that it can be influenced by something and that it can influence other things, which is, for example, the reason why we don't believe in the ether anymore, which was very popular around 1900, because if the ether exists, it would have such property that it wouldn't have any causal influence. Nothing can influence it, and it cannot influence anything else. So integrated information theory starts with phenomenology, my lived experience, the only thing I know of. After all, my experience comes prior to physics, comes prior to neuroscience, comes prior to anything else, right? This is really the most famous deduction in Western thought, René Descartes' cogito ergo sum. The only way I know I exist, or the only way I know the world exists, is because I'm conscious. I infer then, using science and using Bayesian methods, I can infer the existence of other objects, of lawful regularities. I call them scientific laws, etc. But that's all inferential. So that's my omphalos. That's sort of my navel from which I have to start. And then the theory says, ultimately, consciousness is anything that has causal power upon itself. That's ultimately what consciousness is. It defines it in a rigorous mathematical way. You have a mechanism in a particular state. You have a transition probability matrix. You can define how much intrinsic cause-effect this thing has. In other words, you're a mechanism like a brain in a particular state, and you can compute how much the past influences the current state and how much the current state sort of influences the next state. You can compute this. It's a quantity. And it relates to a number you probably have heard of called phi. This number is either 0, which means the system has no cause effect upon itself. It's not conscious, according to the theory. Or it's a number different from 0. They can be very large. And it's a quantity, how irreducible the system is. It's also a way to define a whole, which is more than the sum of the parts, because any system that exists as the whole exists above and beyond the individual components. And the theory makes a number of predictions. I just wanted to end with two predictions. So it makes a number of predictions. One is actually gives rise to practical methods called zap and zip. It's now been tested here, particularly here in Europe by Marcello Massimini and his collaborators. There's a series of papers in Science, in neurology, et cetera, that tested this in a whole variety of different patients with disorder of consciousness and anesthesia and locked-in syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. But more interesting, it makes particular predictions. So for example, in the human brain or in any brain, it says that ultimately the neural correlate of consciousness is a part of the cortex, or the part of the brain in general, and as it would be cortex, that has maximal cause effect upon itself. This is something you can test. In principle, you can compute it, and you can see which part of the brain, at what level of granularity, is it the cellular level, is it subcellular level, is it supracellular level, at what level of gravity, of resolution maximizes cause effect. And then it has a very striking prediction that is completely at odds with modern ideology, particularly with the modern ideology in functionalism. Right, so we all live this ideology, functionalism. Functionalism says that the only thing that matters is the relationship among things. There's nothing intrinsic. All that matters is relationship, input and output. It doesn't matter the system inside. There's all this debate around the Chinese room, et cetera. They're all based on the idea that as long as you replicate the input-output function of anything, you've exhaustively described what that thing is and what it does. But this is exactly the problem. What functionalism, and this is, of course, modern philosophy. For example, Dan Dennett, very strong in that entire tradition of sort of analytic philosophy, has this belief, the identity between what a system is and what a system does. This gives rise to very striking prediction because integrated information theory is very different, rightfully or wrongfully. So it can be tested, that's the advantage. But it makes a striking prediction that ultimately you can take a system, let's say you take a system, a simple neural network or a simple brain like C. elegans, and you can compute phi. And the theory says, yes, it feels a little bit like something to be C. elegans. That's what consciousness is. It feels like something. And in principle, you can now, you have a system of 302 neurons, you have input and output. Of course, you can unfold it, right? Kolmogorov and other people have shown this. You can unfold this system into an equivalent, functionally equivalent, purely feed-forward system. It'll have many, many more neurons than 302, but in principle, you have two systems. One is heavily feedback with 302 neurons. The other one has many more neurons, but for every input, it produces the same output. So functionally, these two networks are identical. And what the IIT says, because finally, consciousness is causal power, which has nothing to do with input-output. It's about the causal power that the system has upon itself. So it says the system that has high phi will be conscious. The system that it's all feed-forward by definition is zero phi, although it has the same input-output transformation, it is not conscious at all. So what that means for us is very, very profoundly anti-intuitive for most of us who are raised, who've drunk the mother milk of functionalism, who worship at the altar of information processing. So let's say Henry's Blue Brain project is incredibly successful, and in 10 years, models the entire human brain. Every neuron, every synapse, every glia cells, everything in this simulation is exactly like it is in the human. And of course, the simulation can talk, because after all, it models the human brain. And of course, it says, I feel fine and I'm conscious, just like Siri. You know, you can ask Siri about it. Try it. Or Alexa, you know, if you have Alexa system. And, but the theory says, if the theory is right, says it's all fake. It's running on as long as it's running on a digital von Neumann machine. The causal architecture of a digital von Neumann machine, programmable digital computers, like we have them in our pockets, like they exist in the cloud, is such that the causal power of that system, A, is very, very small, and B, totally independent of what's being run on this, totally independent of the software. Because you actually have to look at the level of the metal, and you have to look at the level where charge moves, gets shuttled around from one gate to the other. At that level of physical causation, right, that's where finally where the rubber hits the road, at the level of the metal, the integrated information of this system is negligible and doesn't depend on whether Henry's running his blue brain simulation that simulates a human, or whether he happens to do his taxes on this big supercomputer. And the best analogy here I can think about, if you have so I have a friend, she's an astrophysicist, and on her laptop she has MATLAB software running that implements Einstein's field equation, right? So you write down the 9 Einstein field equation for gravity, and she can predict that the central star at the center of our galaxy, it's 10 to the 6 solar masses, that given the relationship between spatial temporal curvature and gravity, that will be a black hole. In other words, the matter is so dense, there will be singularity that nothing, even light, can escape, a black hole. But have you ever thought, isn't it strange that she doesn't get sucked into her laptop? Why not? I mean, the laptop simulates the field equation, right? So there's a functional mapping between the variables in the MATLAB software and gravity in spatial time, spatial gain. But the software doesn't have the causal power of gravity, right? So therefore, space-time around the laptop doesn't really get changed. And so it is with consciousness, and I'd like to finish here. Consciousness ultimately is a physical aspect of our universe. It's how physical systems look from the inside. It's a way a system is inside, and it has causal power. That's what consciousness is. And so you have to recreate the causal power of the brain, which in principle you can do in neuromorphic hardware, but you can't do by just simulating it, because ultimately consciousness is not a computation. Consciousness is a state of being. Thank you.
Any quick question or comment? I know.
State of being. That's the content of consciousness. It is a state of being, not becoming. So computers are all about becoming. Information processing is about becoming. Consciousness is about being. If you're in a state of pure consciousness, you just are. If you lie in a submersion tank and you're there, you're not asleep, you're there, but you're not conscious of anything, that is a state of being. And ultimately, it's... No, it's a state, in this case, of a particular part of my brain. It's not... No, it's a state of the particular physical mechanism that gives rise to consciousness, which in my case is a specific set of neurons and neural mechanisms.
So
experience, any experience.
So consciousness?
Any experience, yeah. Any pain, pleasure. Yes, quite. For me, it's more difficult to infer what a cockroach feels like, yes, but its hardware is very similar to ours. It has B, for example, has complex behavior. Its brain is 80,000 times smaller than our brain, but it's very, very complex. Yes. So this theory sort of is part of the panpsychist tradition in the West, that consciousness is much more widespread than we sort of typically associate with. It's not just us and dogs and cats and monkeys. It's probably much more widespread, and probably throughout the Metazoa.
Yeah, so when you compare it to a computer program, and where you can have a distributed system with many processors, computers, each one doing independently whatever it's doing, and not having any a main program, but as soon as you have a main program, that's something that it's a controller of the system, something that has a purpose, if you will, and then why is that not consciousness in terms of the program, where it knows at every point in time the status of the system and can then make decisions on how to go ahead? And why is consciousness any different?
Lots of systems have a purpose. My thermomat at my home tries to regulate things at a constant degree. So there are lots of things that have purpose. Consciousness is not about purpose. Consciousness ultimately is about influencing your own fate. I mean, that's what the theory postulates. It might be wrong, but that's what the theory postulates.
I would like, I mean, I think we're going to continue this discussion tomorrow. It's actually leading.
We're not going to solve it here? You don't believe?
Not. I want to first thank Christof.